Okay, so we have a low poly, we have it UV'd, and now it's time to bake out the maps for it. This is probably the video that's going to get me the most flack, if anything does generate me any flack. Because everybody seems to have their own way of baking out a normal map, and they seem to have their own philosophies and ideas about how to do it. But I've been explaining my philosophies through the last couple of videos, and now we're going to get down to the we're going to put the rubber on the road here. So there's a couple of steps we need to do, and if you're in Modo, one setting you are going to want to check is if you go into your preferences, you go down to final rendering, there's a bake UV border size setting here. Now mine's set to 16, and that's to allow for bleeding off of the edges of the UV islands. It just helps to eliminate seams. The ideal setting for that is as far as possible, but I've had problems in the past with Modo crashing if I put that up too high, so we're not going to tempt fate and just leave it at 16. Now, in terms of what gets baked inside of Modo, I have been for a while now just baking my normal map inside of Modo. And then I take everything over to Substance Painter to finish up, and you'll see that workflow here shortly. Now you'll probably be surprised to hear that I don't actually change a lot when it comes to the default settings in Modo, or at least not that I can recall anyway. My normal map baking is very just sort of like a brute force operation. So what I will do is, you recall we have a low poly texture on this mesh. Actually, first let's talk about smoothing. I talked earlier about wherever you have a smoothing break on the mesh, you have to have a UV break and that sort of thing. Okay, so now we can apply that in reverse now that we've set it up correctly. So what I'm going to do is use the Vertex Normal toolkit. Now this uses face-weighted normals, which I think are pretty essential on hard surface props to get a good bake. So what I will do is I will hit the apply button with 179 as my smoothing angle. Now watch what happens to the mesh when I do that. Let me turn off the wireframe. I do 179. The whole mesh, basically in 3ds Max terms, is put into one smoothing group. So all polygons are smoothing into all polygons. This is not the way you want to bake this prop. Then we select the texture map and hit this button in the top right corner. This button tells it to harden the edge of every UV island. So I hit that, now things get crisp again. And when you zoom in here, you can kind of see what the face-weighted normals are doing. You can see that as the highlight moves off of this large face and hits the smaller faces, it gets tighter. And that's visually showing you what's happening to the vertex normals. I have another whole video on face-weighted normals, so I'm not going to go into it here. But just know that we're using them and they are pretty much essential. Okay, so with the smoothing set up correctly, I was going to save that real quick. It's time to attempt to bake. So if you're a Modo user, this will be interesting. If not, well, just bear with me. So what I have to do is go into my low poly texture, go to add layer and create a new image. And once I choose a file name off the hard drive, this dialog pops up. Now I generally will set my normal map to 4K for baking, and I'll set the color space to linear, although to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know whether that makes any difference at all, but it's just something I do. So we'll do that. It creates the texture and pops it up here in the shader tree. Now it's set to diffuse color by default. Now let me isolate this mesh. What you want to do is left click it and go down to surface shading and choose normal, because we're baking out a normal map. Now the shading went all janky, but that's because we basically have a blank texture that doesn't have any normal information on it, so don't panic yet. The last step we have to do is generate a cage for this to bake with. Now a cage is simply, well, in terms of Modo, it's a morph map that pushes the low poly mesh out until it completely envelops the high poly mesh. You can think of it as your low poly mesh is the destination for the sampling rays that are going to be shot at the high poly mesh, and the cage is the starting position. So start to finish, somewhere between there, it's expecting to hit your high poly mesh and sample the surface normal. So the simple way that you can work with that is just to make sure that you push it out far enough, and we'll see that here in a second. So let me make a new morph map for this low poly mesh. Call it cage, just for simplicity. And now that the cage is on, I activate the push tool. Let me turn off wireframe too. Now what I would generally do on the first push is just start pushing the low poly out. You can see we're getting more and more of the gray vanishing. And right about here, it seems to have most of the gray hidden, and there's no gray popping out. Give it a little more of a nudge. Now I can hear you back there. You're screaming about these things and this thing, and the feet down here are all sticking out. That's all to facilitate the rounded edge shader, and I'll explain that post bake. But for now, just trust me that that's okay. Now we do have a little gray poking out here because of those pipe deco pieces on top. So I might push this back a little, then grab the entire thing and pull it up so it has a cleaner projection going down. Hide that out, and this, I think, is going to be our cage, because that looks good to me. All right, so click the cage to turn it off. So just to reiterate, and let me kill the normal map for a second. That's with it off, that's the destination. That's with it on, that's the source. So it's going from here to here and expecting to hit the high poly mesh. All right, so from here, well, from here we can just try a normal bake. So let's do that real quick. Okay, so to actually launch a bake in Modo is pretty straightforward. Just find the normal map in the shader tree, right click it, tell it to bake from object to texture. And when it comes up, it wants to know what to use to start the rays off, whether it's just a raw distance or if it's a cage. It's going to be a cage because we just created one. So we're going to pick our cage and tell it to bake. So the render window pops up. Let me zoom up here a little bit on it. And now it'll just plow through and do the normal map bake. This is a good time to just, at least on the first bake, just watch it, just have a look, see if there's any obvious errors that are happening. Sometimes you'll get an island that's all sploogey because maybe you messed up your cage, or you'll see some very obvious skewing, and you might just want to stop the bake and go and fix that. This looks pretty good to me. It's hard to tell on some of these islands because they're wrapped cylindrically, and so here they look a little janky and wavy, but as long as it looks like normal map colors and things are looking good at this stage, I'm happy just to let it roll. Now the last stage it does, is it adds that edge padding that we talked about, and you can kind of see that kind of popping out there on the sides of the islands. Okay, so it's baked our normal map, and if I hop back out to the viewport and isolate the low poly, we can now look at the low poly with the normal map on it. And basically at this stage, I'll just fly around and look at each piece, and or each chunk of the mesh, and just make sure that the normal map looks like what I'm expecting it to look like. Make sure that projections look straight, that kind of thing. There's a little bit of jankiness here because of that too, but I'm not going to worry about it for the purposes of this tutorial. up here, these holes and cutouts look okay. This center part all worked out. The floaters are good. The rib detail is good. The silhouette of the mesh is holding up. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. So next step up is we need to send this over to, actually, not just yet. So one of the things that messed me up when I started doing normal maps in Modo was this render window is showing you the normal map, but by default it's showing it to you in the RGB color space, or the sRGB color space. And I know this is super nerdy crap and I don't really understand it myself. But just know that normal maps need to be in linear space, you know, if you're going to take them to a game engine. Now the second part of this gotcha is you'll be, oh, here it is up here. I'll choose linear from here. Now it looks more like a tangent normal map, and that's great, and you'll save it out. The problem is that won't work. You're still saving an sRGB image. You have to pull this box down and choose linear from here. Now when you save it out, you'll save a linear normal map, which will work in Substance Painter. So we've baked out a normal map, we've saved that normal map, and we've verified that it looks good on the mesh. Before I send a prop to Substance Painter, I typically will reverse the explosion effect that we did, because I like to work with it as a whole unit. So I'm going to right click this and duplicate this mesh, and I'll call it the LP_paint mesh. You have to indicate this is the one I'm going to paint on, and I'll delete the morph map off of that mesh because that sometimes gets a little janky. So let's eliminate jank whenever possible. And the reassembly is basically just a matter of reassembling, and that's why we keep our the original high poly mesh around, so I know where the pieces all go. So in the case of this, let's talk about this splooge that gets dropped onto the meshes. That's because of the rounded edge shader. There was geometry there for it to see and do this, you know, and do the transitions for. But I only want to bake it onto my UV map once over here. So what I do is I now take this piece, and let me turn off the other low poly mesh, drag it over to where I'm happy with it, right about there. There? Yeah. And since we're on the origin, I can then make a radial array of those, just enough that one drops into each slot. And now I'm good to go there. And I'll do the same thing with this piece, pull it back until it's sitting where it needs to sit here, hit it with a radial array, copy those pieces in, and you probably guessed what's going to happen here, but we're going to do the same thing with the feet. I'm going to zoom up here on the foot, make sure that I'm pulling it back to where it's meeting the mesh. See, right in this area here. Looks good. And hit that with a radial array. It needs a few more. Okay. Now those are all in place. Okay. From there, if I toggle on the high poly, I can see this main shell in the middle is in the right place. So that being the case, I can use that as my guide to drop these low poly pieces, you know, back into basically the right spot. So do that. Grab this one, pull it down until it sits where it's supposed to be sitting. Looks like about there. About there. Is that right? Yeah, that looks right. Okay, now I'll grab, we'll reassemble the little knob here. Pull that back. Pull it out a little bit maybe. Pull him back until he sits where he's supposed to sit. Let me toggle off the selection highlight so I can make sure that's right. It's about there. And then grab this piece, pull it back until it sits in the center of where it's supposed to be. That looks about right. Okay. Now this part, I'm going to turn the high poly back on to use it for a guide. Actually, for this one, I'll just use the, or I won't use that. I thought I was going to use the snap to floor script, but for some reason it's not responding. Anywho, let's go ahead. Just, we'll just do it manually. Put him in there. He looks lined up. He's fine. The last thing will be these teeth, which I will then drag back into approximately the right spot, right there. All right. So this is all sitting together and looking like the high poly mesh, more or less. So now that the mesh is basically reassembled and we like the way everything looks, the way everything sits together, this is basically what we designed, except now in a low poly format. The next step is to send this over to Substance Painter. And the way you do that is you export to an FBX file and then import the FBX file when you get over there. But you're going to want to check some settings first. So hop into your Modo preferences and go down to FBX IO. Now there's an Unreal Static preset that came with it, but really all you need to make sure of is that Save Geometry, Save Materials, and Save Smoothing Groups are on. I set Surface Refining to Triangulate Mesh. I don't know what it is by default, but those 4 settings are really all that matter. And with that, I'm going to export this mesh to an FBX, and I'll see you over in Substance Painter. So here we are in Substance Painter. I've pulled the mesh in, and I've also imported the normal map that we saved out from Modo. I import it as a texture. So all I have to do is drag it from here and put it into the normal map slot. And now you see we have the mesh that looks just like it did in Modo. Real quick, we'll check the configuration. You want to set the normal map format to OpenGL. We can export to DirectX later because that's what Unreal Engine wants. But when it comes in from Modo, it comes in OpenGL. So just if you get it in here and things look wrong, things look flipped, just change this normal map format to something else. So now that we have this, we're going to leverage Substance Painter a little bit. Substance Painter can bake maps, but we don't want to give it the high poly mesh because Substance Painter doesn't know how to do the rounded edge shader or any of the tricks that we do in Modo. So that's why we bake the normal map first. And the way that this will work is that if Substance Painter has a mesh and it has a normal map, it will use those 2 items as the bake sources for the other maps. And yes, that's not 100% accurate, but it is close enough for just about everything you'll end up doing. So I'm going to set these, turn off normal and turn off ID because I don't need an ID map. I'm going to bake these at 4K as well, so they're all the same. And then just let it fly. And this will run off and do its thing. And when it gets done, I'll come back. Okay, so the bakes are complete, and we have what looks like a game prop. And of course, it is what we have. So the only thing we have to do now is we have ambient occlusion, curvature, and all those maps are baked out now. So we just need to throw some materials on here and then get it over to Unreal Engine 4. So in terms of materials, let's try a few of these ones here that I've purchased over time. These are from Jonas Ronegard. I butchered that, sorry. But I'll put a link down in the description to his Gumroads so you can make up for my mispronunciation by buying some of his stuff because it's excellent. But we're going to throw his silver medals are pretty nice. This is like a heavily patinaed version. Let's put this on. And that'll compute for a second or two. Yeah, it kind of has like a, this has been laying outside for a while sort of look to it. But we're going for more of a real world kind of look. Let's try Silver 3. I like Silver 3. It's a little rough. How about Silver 2? Silver 2 I like. It's definitely used, but it has a cool vibe to it. So, all right, we're going to go with this. We're going to go with this. And now, most of my props, I will add a custom layer on top called my overlay. I've talked about this before, but the overlay is basically, it's taking the curvature map and overlaying it on top of the mesh. You're using an overlay blend method with a, you're reducing it down to 25% or something like that. But what it does is it helps to punch up the edges a little bit. Like, see if I turn this on and off, it's subtle. And if I turn this up, you can see it more obviously what it's doing. You know, as I toggle this off and on, you can see that those edges get hit more, and the curves really pop out. So depending on the prop, I'll find a good range where I like that to sit. It's not the most realistic effect in the world, obviously, but it's something that I like doing because I think it adds a cool hit to the models. So from here, we're going to go into time lapse. I'm going to try some different materials on different parts of the mesh. I'm going to do a little painting, a little fixing up, and yeah, at the end, hopefully we'll have something that looks cool. I'll see you on the other side. So that's good enough for demonstration purposes. I think we can go a lot further than this. And there was actually a lot of hand painting there that I probably could have circumvented by baking out a Surface ID mask in Modo and bringing that over. And there's another video on the channel about that. But regardless, this looks like this is a pretty good demo prop. And next up, or next video I should say, we're going to talk about bringing it into Unreal Engine 4 and how to set up a nice little presentation level to show off your props.